The air, thick with the ghosts of honeysuckle and coming rain, did not stir. It held its breath as Silas worked. The corn stalks, brittle and gold, stood as silent witnesses in the pre-dawn gloom. Their rustling leaves, the only sound besides the wet, rhythmic work of his hands. He did not think of the man. Not as a man. He thought of him as material. Hemp rope, coarse and biting. A splintered cedar post, its wood still smelling of forest sap and sun. Straw, dry and dusty, spilling from the split seams of a burlap sack. And the flesh, which was the most stubborn material of all. It was heavy, graceless, a dead weight that fought him with the sheer dumb physics of its mass. Master Thorne had been a large man, broad in the shoulder and thick in the gut from years of feasting on the labor of others. Now that bulk was a curse Silas had to wrestle with in the quiet dark. He hoisted the body onto the crossbeam of the post he'd driven deep into the rich Arkansas earth, the very earth Thorne had claimed as his own. The arms, already stiffening, were a struggle. He had to break them at the elbow to drape them properly. The sound a dull, wet crack that was swallowed by the vast, listening silence of the fields. He bound the wrists to the wood with strips of rawhide cut from a tanning shed. He stuffed the man's fine linen shirt and woolen trousers with straw, pulling it from the sack and packing it in until the form swelled, becoming a grotesque parody of the man it had been. It was a scarecrow's body now, bloated and unnatural. The head was the last part. It lolled on its broken neck, the face turned toward the lightening sky. The eyes were open, filmed over with the first milky glaze of death, reflecting nothing. Silas took Thorne's own wide-brimmed straw hat, the one he wore to survey his kingdom of cotton and corn, and jammed it onto the head, pulling it low to shadow the vacant stare. He stepped back, his bare feet sinking into the cool, damp soil. He was covered in it. The blood, the dirt, the sweat of his exertion. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a small explosion in his chest. He looked at his creation. It was a thing of profound horror, a scarecrow made of the crow, the effigy slumped against the post, a monstrous sentinel guarding the rows of corn. In the rising light, its shadow stretched long and thin, a finger of accusation pointing back toward the great house, which was still dark, still sleeping, unaware of the sacrilege that had been committed in its fields. There was no triumph in him, only a vast, hollow emptiness. The rage that had fueled him for the past 12 hours had burned itself out, leaving behind only the ash of what he had done. He had seen the welt on his daughter's back, a single raised line of furious red where the master's riding crop had caught her for the crime of spilling a pitcher of water. Ilara was 4. She had cried, a sound not of pain, but of pure bewildered terror. And in that sound, something in Silas, a thing long caged and starving, had broken free. He had waited until the house was quiet, until the whiskey had claimed the master in his study. He had used a cotton hook. It had been quick, and it had been silent. The rest had been a ritual, an unmaking. He looked at his left hand. In the pale light, the scar on his palm seemed to glow. It was a crescent moon, a brand from a previous master, an iron that had slipped and marked him uniquely. It ached now, a phantom pain that was a constant companion to his life. He flexed his fingers, the scar pulling the skin tight. It was the hand that had held Ilara when she was born. It was the hand that had guided a plow, picked 1,000 pounds of cotton, and taken a life. A single bird called from the edge of the woods, a sharp, piercing cry that broke the spell. It was time. He turned his back on the scarecrow and ran, not toward the slave quarters, but toward the small cabin at the edge of the woods, where his daughter slept. He moved like a ghost through the familiar landscape, his feet knowing every root, every stone. The world was waking up, and he had to be gone before it saw what he had done. He had to take Ilara and disappear into the land that had both raised and broken him. He had to become a creature of the swamp, a whisper in the cypress trees, a memory that would curdle into legend. He had declared war not just on a man, but on the world that had made the man a master. And he knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as Riverstone, that the world would hunt him for it. It would send its dogs, its men, and its laws. It would not rest until it had reclaimed his body, his life, his very name. But in the half-light of that Arkansas morning, with the smell of blood on his skin and the image of the Scarecrow burned into his mind, all he could think of was the small, warm weight of his daughter in his arms, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness that lay ahead. He found Ilara curled on her thin straw pallet, her small body rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of sleep. A stray beam of light from the cabin's single window touched her face, and for a heart-stopping moment he could not breathe. She was the mirror of her mother, Lyra, who had been sold south 2 years ago. Same dark, luminous eyes, same mouth that held the hint of a smile even in sleep. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her. The lullaby his own mother had sung to him, a fragment of a language he no longer knew, rose in his throat. Sambo way, o alale, mondo, mondo. The words were ghosts, sounds without meaning, but they held the full weight of his history, of every loss, every chain, every lash of the whip. He scooped her up, her small body warm and pliant against his chest. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, and burrowed her face into his neck. The scent of her, clean and sweet, was a stark contrast to the metallic tang of death that clung to him. He wrapped her in a rough woolen blanket, grabbing a small sack that held a piece of hardtack and a dried gourd for water. It was not enough. It was everything. He slipped out of the cabin and into the woods, the world behind him dissolving into shades of gray. The sun was not yet up, but the sky was turning from indigo to a soft, bruised purple. He moved swiftly, his long legs eating up the ground, Ilara a precious sleeping burden. He did not look back. To look back was to be turned to salt, to be frozen in the horror of what he had left behind. He had to keep moving, to put the plantation, the Scarecrow, the entire world of bondage behind him. His destination was the great cypress swamp, a sprawling, untamed labyrinth of black water, ancient trees, and things that had no name. It was a place the overseers feared, a place where a man could disappear. It was a place where a man could also die. The discovery was made by a field hand named Moses, an old man whose back was permanently stooped into a question mark. He had gone to the cornfield to fetch a tool he'd left behind, and had seen the strange figure silhouetted against the rising sun. At first he thought it was a joke, a particularly morbid one. Then he saw the boots, Master Thorne's fine leather boots, peeking out from beneath the straw-stuffed trousers. He saw the glint of the gold ring on the bound hand. He let out a cry that was thin and reedy, the sound of a terrified bird. It carried on the morning air, across the fields, all the way to the overseer's house. The overseer's name was Calloway. He was a lean, sun-scorched man with eyes the color of a washed-out sky. He did not run. He walked to the cornfield with a long, deliberate stride, his face a mask of grim disbelief. When he saw it, he stopped. He did not touch it. He simply stood and looked, taking in every detail. The broken arms, the straw bursting from the shirt, the hat pulled low. He saw the sheer, calculated audacity of the act. This was not a murder of passion. It was a statement, a sermon delivered in blood and straw. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was an affront to the natural order of things, an act so profane it threatened to unravel the very fabric of their world. He turned and walked back to the house, his mind already working, cataloging the faces of the slaves, searching for the one capable of such a thing, the one who was missing. By mid-morning, The thorn plantation was a hive of frantic, terrified activity. The mistress, a pale, fragile woman named Eleanor, had fainted upon hearing the news and been put to bed with smelling salts. The house slaves whispered in shadowed corners, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something unreadable. Calloway had conducted a roll call. Every man, woman, and child accounted for, except two, Silas and his daughter, Ilara. The name settled in the air like poison. Silas, strong, quiet, a good worker. But there was a stillness in him, a depth in his gaze that Calloway had always found unsettling. He remembered the crescent moon brand on his hand. He remembered the way Silas looked at him sometimes, without fear, without deference, just a flat obsidian stare. Calloway unlocked the plantation office. The room smelled of leather, ink, and Thorne's cheap cigars. He sat at the master's desk, the chair still holding the faint impression of the man's weight. He pulled out the plantation ledger. His handwriting was neat, precise, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. He found the entry for Silas. Male. Approx. 30 years. Prime field hand. Strong. Intelligent. Purchased from the Bleecker Estate, 1858. Previous history unknown. Marked with a crescent-shaped brand. Left palm. Moody disposition. Potential for defiance. To be watched. Beneath it, in Thorne's sprawling, arrogant script, was a more recent note. His get, Ilara, shows promise for housework. Likes to sing. Annoying. So Sliders. Calloway slammed the ledger shut. He knew what he had to do. He would gather the dogs. He would send riders to the neighboring plantations and to the sheriff in the nearest town. He would draft a bounty poster. He would hunt Silas down, and when he found him, he would make an example of him. He would bring him back and hang him from the tallest oak tree on the property, and he would leave the body there to rot, a different kind of scarecrow, a warning to any other slave who dared to dream of raising a hand against their master. The world had been turned upside down, and it was his job, his sacred duty, to set it right. Silas plunged deeper into the swamp. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of decay and wet earth. The sunlight, which had been a pale wash in the fields, was now a dappled, uncertain thing, filtered through a dense canopy of cypress and tupelo trees. Spanish moss hung from the branches in long, ghostly shrouds, swaying in the unfelt currents of air. The ground beneath his feet became soft, then spongy, then gave way to murky, knee-deep water. Ilara had woken up, her initial whimpers of confusion turning into a quiet, watchful silence as she clung to him. She was a child of the fields, and this place, with its strange sounds and grasping shadows, was an alien world. "Where are we going, Papa?" she whispered, her small voice a fragile sound in the immense quiet. "Away," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We're going to find the North Star." It was a story, a myth whispered in the quarters, a dream of a land where a man's skin did not determine his fate. He didn't know if it was real, or how to find it. Right now, his only star was survival. He moved with a hunter's instinct, his senses alive to the world around him. He heard the plop of a turtle sliding off a log, the drone of 1,000 insects, the distant cry of a hawk. He saw the flicker of a water moccasin, its dark body a ribbon of death in the black water. He felt the suck of the mud at his ankles, the scratch of thorns on his skin. This was a world of primal forces, a world that did not care about masters or slaves. Here, there was only the hunter and the hunted, the living and the dead. And for the first time in his life, he felt a strange, terrifying kinship with it. He was no longer Silas, the field hand. He was a creature of the swamp, as wild and as desperate as any other. He found a small hummock of dry land, a tiny island in the vast morass, crowned by a massive, ancient cypress whose roots spread out like grasping claws. He gently set Elara down. Her legs were shaky. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with questions he could not answer. He gave her a piece of the hardtack, and she gnawed on it slowly, her hunger overriding her fear. He kept watch, his eyes scanning the surrounding water, his ears tuned to any unnatural sound. He thought of the Scarecrow. The image was seared into his memory, a tableau of his own making. He had not just killed a man, he had desecrated a body. He had committed an act that defied the laws of God and man. He had taken the symbol of their power, the master, and turned it into a symbol of his own rage, a thing of mockery and rot. He had given them a story, a horror story, and he knew they would never forgive him for it. He touched the scar on his palm, the crescent moon. He remembered the day he got it. He had been a boy, no older than 10, on a different plantation, with a different master. He had been accused of stealing a biscuit. The master, a small, rat-faced man, had heated the branding iron, the one used for marking livestock. It was supposed to be a simple B for Bleecker, but the man had been drinking, and his hand had slipped. The iron had seared a perfect, beautiful, terrible crescent into the soft flesh of his hand. He had not cried out. He had bitten his tongue until it bled, the coppery taste of his own blood filling his mouth. He had learned then that to show pain was to give them a victory. The scar was his first lesson in the art of endurance. Now it felt different. It was not just a mark of ownership, it was his own, a part of him, a dark moon he carried with him always. A sound drifted through the trees. Faint, but unmistakable, the baying of hounds. Calloway stood over the dog pen, a leather leash coiled in his hand. The dogs, a mix of bloodhounds and curs, were in a frenzy, their deep-throated barks echoing through the morning air. They smelled the hunt. He had sent a rider with one of Silas's old shirts, letting the dogs get the scent. He had gathered a posse of a half-dozen men from neighboring farms, their faces grim, their rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They were not just hunting a runaway slave. They were putting down an insurrection. They were restoring order. "He's headed for the swamp," one of the men said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Only a fool would go in there." "Silas is no fool," Calloway said, his voice flat. He clipped the leash onto the collar of the lead dog, a massive bloodhound named Judge. "He's desperate, and a desperate man is more dangerous than a fool." He looked toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the swamp. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a place he hated. But he would go in, he would follow Silas into the very belly of that green hell if he had to. He would not be beaten by a slave in a swamp. He mounted his horse, the leather of the saddle creaking. "Let's go," he said, and gave the signal. The dogs surged forward, straining at their leashes, their voices a ragged chorus of bloodlust. The hunt had begun. The sound of the dogs sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Silas. He snatched Elara, pulling her tight against him, his hand clamped over her mouth to stifle the cry that rose in her throat. "Shh, little bird," he whispered, his voice urgent. "We have to be quiet now. Quieter than mice." He slid into the water, its coldness a shock against his warm skin. He kept the cypress trunk between him and the direction of the barking, moving deeper into the swamp. The water rose to his waist, then his chest. He held Elara above it, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck. The mud sucked at his feet, trying to pull him down, to hold him in place for the dogs. Each step was a monumental effort. The baying grew louder, closer. He could hear the crashing of men and horses through the undergrowth at the swamp's edge. They were coming. He scanned the water, his eyes wide with desperation. He saw it then. A hollow log, half submerged, covered in moss and fungus. It was a risk. It could be home to a snake, a nest of spiders. But it was his only chance. He waded toward it, his movements slow and deliberate, trying not to make a ripple. He reached the log and peered inside. It was dark, and smelled of rot. He took a deep breath. He looked at Ilara, whose eyes were wide with terror. He brought his lips to her ear. "We're going to play a game," he whispered. "The quiet game. We have to hide in here. You cannot make a sound, my love. Not a single sound. Do you understand?" She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. He kissed her forehead, then gently pushed her into the hollow of the log. He slid in after her, pulling a curtain of Spanish moss over the opening. The world went dark. The space was cramped, suffocating. The water inside was cold and slimy, and something brushed against his leg. He fought the urge to flinch. He held Ilara against him, his body a shield. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. He put his fingers to her lips, a silent reminder. The barking was deafening now. It was right on top of them. He could hear the splashing of the dogs as they entered the water, the shouted commands of the men. "He's in here somewhere. The scent is strong." That was Calloway's voice, sharp and clear. "Damn this place," another voice grumbled. "He could be anywhere." A dog was whining, circling near their log. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. He held his breath. Ilara was trembling in his arms, a small, terrified animal. He began to hum, the sound so low it was more a vibration in his chest than a noise. Natas, O alele mondo mondo, the ancient lullaby, a thread of sound connecting him to his mother, to his past, to a time before this terror. He felt Ilara's trembling lessen, her body relaxing slightly against his. The dog barked, a sharp, frustrated sound, right outside the log. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. This was it. They were found. But then he heard Calloway's voice again, angry and impatient. "He's thrown them off the scent, the water's confusing them. Spread out. Check every island, every thicket. He can't have gone far." The splashing and shouting moved away, receding into the distance. The baying grew fainter. Silas stayed, hidden in the log, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. He listened until the only sounds were the natural sounds of the swamp, the buzzing of mosquitoes, the croak of a frog, the drip of water from a cypress knee. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He had survived the first test. But he knew it was only the beginning. The hunters were in his world now, and they would not give up. He was no longer just a man running for his life. He was the ghost in the machine, the dark rumor, the Scarecrow's creator. And his war had just begun. Days bled into a week. Silas and Ilara lived a half-life in the swamp, a furtive, nocturnal existence. They slept during the day, hidden in dense canebrakes or on high branches of cypress trees, and moved at night, guided by the moon and the stars. Silas became a creature of immense patience and cunning. He learned the swamp's rhythms, its secret languages. He learned which mushrooms were safe to eat, how to catch fish with his bare hands, how to build a smokeless fire in a hollow stump. He learned the patterns of the hunting parties, their lazy midday rests, their cautious advances at dawn and dusk. He saw them often, distant figures in skiffs, their rifles glinting in the sun, the mournful cries of their hounds a constant, threatening music on the wind. Ilara adapted with the resilience of a child. The swamp became her new world. She learned the names of the birds, to tell a moccasin from a harmless water snake to be as quiet as a shadow. But the strange showed in the new hollows of her cheeks, in the way she would start at any sudden noise, in the nightmares that made her cry out in her sleep. In those moments, Silas would hold her and hum the lullaby, the fragmented melody, a prayer against the darkness. No wa lele. Mondo, Mondo. It was a fragile shield, but it was all he had. His body grew leaner, harder. His skin was cross-hatched with a map of scratches and insect bites. But his mind grew sharper. The rage that had driven him to kill Thorn had cooled into a single, hard point of focus. Protect Ilara. Get her out. Every sunrise was a victory. Every sunset a new threat. He began to see the world differently. He saw the beauty in the swamp's desolation, the fierce, uncompromising will to live in every plant and creature. He found a patch of spider lilies growing on a small, muddy bank. Their delicate, blood-red blossoms, with their long, curling stamens, seemed too beautiful for such a place. They reminded him of Lyra. She had loved wildflowers, had always found a way to have a small, bright bloom in a jar of water in their cabin, a tiny act of rebellion against the ugliness of their lives. He picked one of the lilies and tucked it into Ilara's hair. She smiled, a rare, brilliant flash of light in the gloom. The flower became their secret symbol, a promise of beauty in a world of mud and fear. Back on the thorn plantation, Calloway's frustration curdled into a cold, obsessive rage. The Scarecrow still stood in the cornfield. The mistress, Eleanor, in a fit of hysteria, had forbidden anyone from taking it down. "Leave it," she had shrieked. "Let it stand as a monument to this godless land." So it remained, a decomposing horror, its fine clothes tattered by the wind and rain, its straw body becoming a home for insects and birds. It was a constant, mocking reminder of Calloway's failure. He had circulated the bounty poster far and wide. The ink was stark and black on the cheap paper. $500 reward, wanted for the ACT of murder and insurrection, the runaway Negro. Silas, formerly the property of the late Mr. Jonathan Thorn, approximately 30 years of age, stands near to 6 feet in height, powerfully built. Complexion is of a dark cast, has a distinctive scar in the shape of a crescent moon on the palm of his left hand. Believed to be armed and is extremely dangerous. He is accompanied by his female child, Ilara, aged 4 years. The above reward will be paid for his capture and delivery to the Thorn Plantation, or for proof of his death. R. Calloway, Overseer. The poster had brought men from all over the county. Farmers with old muskets, town dwellers with a taste for blood sport, and professional slave catchers, with their cold eyes and specialized tools. Among them was a man they called the Gray Man. He was not a bounty hunter in the traditional sense. He was a tracker, a legend in the territory, a gaunt, silent man who was said to be more at home in the wilderness than in a town. He worked alone, with only a pair of vicious, half-starved dogs that seemed more wolf than canine. He arrived at the Thorn Plantation one afternoon, a wraith on a pale horse, and spoke to Calloway in a voice that was like the rustle of dry leaves. "I hear you lost something," the Gray Man said, his eyes scanning the swamp's edge. "I lost a murderer," Calloway corrected, his voice tight. The Gray Man dismounted. He was taller than Calloway had expected, and thin as a rail. He walked to the dog pen and looked at Calloway's hounds. He made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, and judged the lead dog whimpered and pressed itself to the back of the cage. The Gray Man's own dogs stood at his heels, silent and watchful, their yellow eyes unblinking. "Your dogs are loud," the Gray Man said. "A loud dog tells a man you're coming." "I prefer to listen." He walked to the edge of the swamp and picked up a handful of mud, crumbling it in his long, bony fingers, smelling it. "He's still in there. He's learning the water, becoming a part of it. This will take time, and it will cost you." "I'll pay whatever it takes," Calloway said. The price was not just money, it was his reputation, his authority, his belief in the order of the world. He needed Silas's body, dangling from a rope, to restore that order. The Gray Man nodded slowly. "500 is for the body," he said, his pale eyes fixing on Calloway. "For the legend, the price is higher." Without another word, he melted into the tree line, his 2 dogs moving like shadows at his side. A new, more dangerous phase of the hunt had begun. Silas knew the new hunter was there before he ever saw him. The swamp changed. The patrols became less frequent but more deliberate. Traps appeared, simple snares and deadfalls, on the paths he had used. He found one of his fishing spots poisoned, the water clouded, the fish floating belly up. This was not Calloway's work. This was someone who knew the wilderness, who thought like he did. A cold dread, different from the frantic fear he'd felt before, settled in his bones. He was no longer just evading a posse. He was being stalked by a predator. He became even more cautious, doubling back on his own trails, wading through water for miles to leave no scent, teaching Alara to walk on logs and roots to leave no prints. He felt a constant prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. One evening as dusk was settling, he was perched in a tree, watching a clearing. He saw a flicker of movement. It was the gray man. He was not dressed for the swamp. He wore dark, town-style clothes that seemed to absorb the light. He moved with an unnerving grace, his 2 dogs trotting at his side without a sound. He stopped in the middle of the clearing, a spot where Silas and Alara had rested 2 days before. The man knelt, his long fingers brushing the ground. He picked up something small and held it to the fading light. It was the wilted, browning spider lily that had fallen from Alara's hair. The gray man looked at it. Then his head lifted, his gaze sweeping the trees, his eyes seeming to bore right through the foliage, right into Silas's hiding place. Silas's blood ran cold. The man smiled, a thin, lipless stretching of his mouth. He then stood up and continued on, moving in the exact direction Silas had taken. The game had changed. This was a battle of wits, a deadly chess match played across a board of mud and cypress. Silas felt a surge of something he had not felt since the night he killed Thorn, a cold, clarifying rage. This man was hunting his child. He was not just a threat to be evaded. He was an enemy to be fought. Silas was no longer just prey. He had to become a hunter himself. He began to set his own traps, not to kill, but to mislead, to wound. He used his knowledge of the swamp to his advantage. He crafted false trails that led to snake-infested thickets or deep sinkholes of quicksand. He used sharpened cane stakes, hidden in the mud along the waterways. He became a ghost, a malevolent spirit of the swamp. The legends Calloway had feared were now being born out of necessity. The other hunters grew fearful. They spoke of a demon in the swamp, a massive black man with a moon-shaped scar who could walk on water and command the snakes. Several of them abandoned the hunt, unnerved by the silent, watching wilderness and the stories that were breeding in it. But the gray man was not deterred. He seemed to anticipate Silas's moves, sidestepping the traps, reading the false signs. One of his dogs fell victim to a cane stake, its yelp a sharp, shocking sound in the night. The next day, Silas found the dog's body left on his trail, its throat cut. A message. I am still here. I am still coming. The pressure was immense. Alara was growing weaker. The meager diet of fish, roots, and berries was not enough. She had a persistent cough, and her small body was racked with feverish shivers at night. Silas was haunted by his powerlessness to help her. He could fight a man, he could outwit dogs, but he could not fight a fever. Her survival depended on getting out of the swamp, on finding real food, real shelter. He had to make a move. He had to do something drastic. He had heard the slave patrols talking, their voices carrying over the water at night. They spoke of the war, of the secession of Arkansas from the Union. They spoke of a great unease, of supplies being diverted, of men being called up to fight. But they also spoke of the upcoming harvest festival at the Thorn Plantation. In a desperate attempt to restore a sense of normalcy, of mastery, Eleanor Thorn had insisted the annual feast go on. It was to be a grand affair, a defiant gesture to the world, to the ghost in their swamp, that their way of life would not be broken. An idea, mad and desperate, began to form in Silas's mind, a plan born of love and fury. He would not run north. Not yet. He would go back. He would return to the heart of the beast, to the place of his bondage. He would use their celebration, their defiant feast, as a weapon against them. He would give them a harvest they would never forget. He would burn it all to the ground. The night of the harvest festival was thick and starless, the air charged with the promise of a coming storm. On the thorn plantation, the great house blazed with light, every window a warm golden eye. Carriages lined the long drive, and the sound of laughter and fiddle music spilled out onto the manicured lawns. It was a scene of defiant opulence, a world away from the dark, hungry reality of the swamp. Calloway stood on the veranda, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face a grim mask. He hated this. It felt like dancing on a grave. The Scarecrow still stood in the cornfield, a skeletal guest at the feast. The gray man was out there, somewhere in the darkness, a patient predator. And Silas was still free. Calloway felt the foundations of his world cracking beneath his feet. Silas moved through the darkness like a wraith, Alara strapped to his back, sleeping fitfully under the influence of a calming root he had found. He had spent days watching the plantation, learning the routines, the placement of the guards. He knew this land better than any of them. It was in his bones, in his blood. He carried a small bundle, a collection of dried moss, pitch-rich pine knots, and a stolen flint and steel. His plan was simple and terrible. He was not going to attack the house. He was going to attack the source of its wealth, its power, the cotton gin. The gin was a massive wooden structure that stood near the river, filled with the recent harvest. It was a tinderbox, a monument to a year of back-breaking labor. He reached it undetected, the sounds of the party providing perfect cover. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady. He piled the tinder against the dry wooden walls, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He looked at the crescent moon, scar on his hand. It seemed to shine in the faint ambient light from the house. He thought of his mother, of Lyra, of Alara. He thought of the generations of stolen lives that had been fed into this machine, this world. He was not just burning a building, he was burning a history. He struck the flint against the steel. A spark. Another. A tiny flame caught in the dried moss. It flickered, then grew. A hungry, living thing. He was turning to leave when a voice cut through the night. "I knew you'd come back." Silas froze. The gray man stood not 20 feet away, a long rifle held loosely in his hands. His 2 dogs, one of them limping, stood at his side, silent and menacing. "You're not like the others," the gray man said, his voice conversational, calm. "You have a purpose. I admire that. But your purpose ends here." Silas gently slid Alara from his back, propping her sleeping form against a stack of cotton bales. "My purpose is my own," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He pulled the cotton hook from his belt, the same tool he had used on Thorn. Its curved steel point glinted. The flames behind him were beginning to lick up the walls of the gin, casting a flickering, hellish light on the scene. The gray man raised his rifle. "Don't be a fool. There's nowhere left to run." At that moment the first clap of thunder rolled across the sky, a deep, guttural growl. The wind picked up, whipping through the clearing, fanning the flames. The fire roared, a sudden explosion of heat and light. The gray man was momentarily distracted, his eyes flicking toward the inferno. It was the only opening Silas needed. He charged, not at the man, but to the side, toward the river. He grabbed a heavy wooden mallet used for pounding cotton bales and hurled it at the dogs. It caught one in the flank, and the animal yelped in pain. The gray man fired. The shot went wide, the bullet splintering the wood of a bale next to Silas's head. Silas didn't stop. He scooped up Ilara and plunged into the dark, churning water of the river. The current was strong, pulling at him, trying to drag him under. He held Ilara's head above the water, his powerful legs kicking, fighting the river's pull. The gray man ran to the riverbank, reloading his rifle with furious speed. He raised it to fire again, but a figure emerged from the shadows behind him. It was Calloway. He had seen the first flicker of the fire and come to investigate. "What in God's name?" he shouted over the roar of the flames and the storm. "He's in the river!" the gray man yelled, pointing. Calloway saw the dark shape in the water, a head, and a smaller bundle moving. Downstream, he raised his own pistol, but at that moment the fire reached the oil stores inside the gin. The building erupted in a massive fireball, a volcanic explosion that lit up the entire sky. The force of the blast threw both Calloway and the gray man to the ground. The party at the great house dissolved into screams and chaos. The world had become an apocalypse of fire and storm. Silas was carried by the current, the river his only ally. He looked back once. He saw the plantation silhouetted against a wall of flame, a vision of Judgment Day. He saw the great house, its windows reflecting the fire, like eyes witnessing its own doom. He saw the Scarecrow in the cornfield, briefly illuminated, its arms outstretched, as if in welcome to the inferno. Then the river carried him around a bend, and the sight was gone. He was alone with his daughter, in the storm-tossed darkness, the roar of the fire replaced by the roar of the river. He did not know if he was swimming toward freedom or a different kind of death. But he was moving, and for now, that was enough. In the morning, the thorn plantation was a ruin. The cotton gin was a pile of smoldering ash. The fire had spread, carried by the storm winds, and consumed the overseer's house and several of the outbuildings. The great house itself was scarred, one wing blackened and gutted. The Scarecrow was gone, consumed by the flames that had swept through the dry cornfield. Of Master Thorn, nothing remained but a legend and a scorched patch of earth. They found the gray man's body downriver, tangled in the roots of a cypress tree. His rifle was gone, and there was a deep, crescent-shaped wound in his neck. Calloway survived, his arm broken, his face burned. He told the sheriff that Silas had set the fire, and that he had seen him drown in the river, swept away by the current. It was the official story. The hunt was called off. The bounty was never paid. Silas, the slave who turned his master into a scarecrow, was declared dead. But the stories did not die. For years, runaway slaves moving north through Arkansas whispered tales of a ghost in the great cypress swamp, a tall, silent man with a crescent moon scar on his hand who would appear in the dead of night to guide them, to leave food on the trail, to chase off the slave catchers, dogs with a low, haunting lullaby that sounded like the wind in the trees. Some said he had a daughter with him, a girl with eyes like dark stars, who could speak to the birds. Others said he had drowned in the river, and it was his angry spirit that lingered, forever bound to the land of his suffering. No one ever knew for sure. Silas and Ilara had vanished from the world of records and ledgers, melting into the realm of myth. They became a story told by a fireside, a song hummed to a frightened child, a symbol of a rebellion so profound it had to be spoken of in whispers. Epilogue, Memphis, 1932. The young woman from the Federal Writers Project sat on the porch of the small, neat house, her notepad in her lap. The old woman in the rocking chair opposite her was named Sarah Jane Washington. She was 93 years old, her skin a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her eyes still sharp and clear. Her grandmother had been a slave on a plantation in Arkansas. "Tell me a story from the old times," the young writer said, her pencil poised. "A true one." Sarah Jane rocked back and forth, the chair creaking in a slow, steady rhythm. "Truth is a slippery thing, child," she said, her voice a soft, reedy whisper. "It changes with the telling. But I'll tell you the story of the Scarecrow Man. My grandma told it to me, and her mama told it to her. She told the story of a cruel master and a slave named Silas. She told of a terrible act in a cornfield, of a desperate flight into a swamp, of a great fire that burned a plantation to the ground. She spoke of him not as a murderer, but as an avenger, a spirit of justice. "They say he died in the river," Sarah Jane said, her eyes looking at something far away. "But my grandma never believed it. She said some folks are too strong, or maybe just too angry, to die." She stopped rocking and leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Years later, after the surrender, a letter came to one of the freed families still living in the area. It had no name on it, and it came from a town way up north, a place in Canada. The paper was old and soft. Most folks couldn't read, but my Uncle James could. He said the handwriting was rough, like it was hard for the man to form the letters. The writer leaned in, her pencil scratching furiously. "What did it say?" Sarah Jane smiled, a slow, mysterious smile. "It didn't say much, just a few lines. It said, 'The North Star is real. The little bird has learned to fly. Tell our people to look for the moon.'" She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, tattered Bible. She opened it carefully, its pages brittle with age. Tucked inside was a pressed flower. It was faded and delicate, but its shape was still clear, a blood-red blossom with long, curling, spider-like tendrils. "My grandma said a free man traveling down from the north gave this to her," Sarah Jane said, her old fingers gently touching the fragile petals. "He said a woman gave it to him. An old woman with a young voice, who lived in a free settlement across the border. He said she told him it was a spider lily. She said it grew in a place of great darkness, but it was a reminder that beauty can survive anything. She also taught him a little song, a lullaby she said her father used to sing." Sarah Jane closed her eyes, and in a voice that was suddenly clear and young, she began to hum. It was a strange, haunting melody, made of only a few repeating notes, a fragment of a lost world. The young writer stopped writing and just listened, the sound filling the quiet afternoon air, a thread of memory stretching back through the years, back to a dark swamp, a desperate father, and a love that had refused to be extinguished. The line between history and myth is drawn in water and smoke. Was Silas a man or a ghost? A murderer or a liberator? Perhaps he was all of these things. Slavery was a system that sought to unmake people, to turn them into property, into tools, into things. It sought to erase their names, their families, their gods. But it could not erase the human heart, in all its capacity for love, grief, and, when pushed past the limits of endurance, a rage as righteous and as cleansing as fire. The story of Silas is not a story of a monster. It is the story of a man who, in a world determined to dehumanize him, chose to reclaim his own narrative, using the very tools of horror that had been used against him. He turned his master into a scarecrow, an empty thing of straw and stolen clothes, and in doing so, he became something more than a man. He became an idea. And an idea, unlike a man, can never truly be caught, or killed, or chained. It can only run, and hide, and wait, and whisper its dangerous, hopeful, and terrible story in the dark.